All right, now we got that. He was very close. It's PRODPAD, and my name is Janna Bastow. Thank you very much. So I'm going to be talking today about growing up lean. Now, many of you are familiar with this product lifecycle chart. Well, we're mostly familiar with the uphill battle and the grind involved in, getting that initial traction and getting to that miraculous product market fit, whatever that might mean to each of us. That launch and the growth portion actually represents a really small piece of the actual product life cycle. The MVP that everyone talks about, well, it happens right here, right at the very beginning of your product. However, most of us here are not working on some brand new greenfield product. Most of us have adopted some product, right? You didn't start your company. You've moved into a company and you've got existing customers and you've got constraints, tech constraints. You probably have a good chunk of tech debt already. And you probably have a messy backlog full of features that, you're never going to be able to work all the way through. And yet, if you're looking at the volume of sales, it's actually at this maturity stage where most of the money is made. And it's also where churn really hurts. When you're in an early stage company, it's easy to mask an ugly churn rate, especially if you've got a frothy market and lots of money being piled into acquisition. But once you've saturated the market, that churn problem really starts to kick in. See, it's at this maturity level that it starts to bite back. And yet, if you look at Medium and elsewhere, everything that people talk about and what you read about, it's all about launching products and optimizing for growth. There's a lot less shared about managing products that are mature or, God forbid, in decline. Which is a shame, because it's exactly at those stages where things start to get hard. So, in the growth stage, your team is much more focused on getting that product market fit. They're doing whatever it takes to get traction and to prove that their product has a place in the world. And yet, in the maturity stage, you've got existing and new users to build for. You've got built-in constraints and technical complexity. You've got people and politics to work around. And so in short, maturity comes with problems. And so one of the problems that you might find is that you've actually become a bit of a feature factory. In those early days, each new feature that you built and put out there got you more sales, got you more downloads. It made you hyper agile, and you were pushing ahead of the competition. Those were the good days. But in the later stage, your goal is not to deliver features. Everyone knows that a whole bunch of features does not necessarily make a better product. And yet, you were doing it in your early stages, you had a great cadence, and so those early habits are actually possibly leading you astray. And so focus on objectives instead of features. And the thing is, inherently, people and teams understand this. They know that a big pile of features isn't exactly what their customers want. And it's a pattern that I just see happening over and over and over again. And personally, I blame the roadmap. Roadmaps aren't inherently bad. In fact, they can be a great tool for communicating your product strategy. And yet, a badly done roadmap can pave the way to a feature-filled product death. So, I implore you all to do this with me here today. Ditch your timeline roadmap. All right, I know this format makes you look really good today. Your board and your bosses love when you can give them this level of certainty about what you're going to build, but it's setting you up for failure. See, if you deconstruct this format of the roadmap, you basically get a chart. It's a chart that maps out time versus things to do, with time along the X there that creates this timeline. And at first it seems pretty easy and intuitive to use, especially in the short term. But the more you put on there and the further you plan, the harder it becomes to manage. And so, because you've got that timeline sitting at the top, always marching forward, no matter what you put on there, everything includes a due date and some time estimate, just by the format of this roadmap. And so what you're actually ending up with is a whole bunch of features and a big pile of deadlines, and it's all basically a big pile of assumptions stacked one on top of the other. And so the first assumption you're making with this format is that you know how long each of these is going to take. Now, this might be easy for the stuff that you've broken down and got good estimates from your development team in the short term, but the further down the list you go, the more you're actually making up, the less clarity you've got. And the other assumption is that you're assuming that nothing else is going to disrupt your timeline. No new competitors, no feature requests, no new insights from the market, no need for iteration. And the other assumption is that you're also assuming that each of these features is going to work as soon as it's launched. So let's say you put 3 weeks into that new checkout page, then you're assuming that it's going to be converting exactly as expected at the end of that, and no need to go back and do another sprint. And by explicitly adding these features to the timeline, you're assuming that each of these features actually deserves to exist, that they form part of your strategy and deserve to be codified. And at the end of the day, you're making one big assumption, which is that nothing is going to change. So what could possibly go wrong? Well, you've got these made-up release dates that are sending your developers on these marches towards these stressful dates. You've got your sales and your customers who have expectations about what's going to be built and when. And oftentimes you're actually missing opportunities in the market. And more often than not, downright building the wrong thing, which leads to you and us becoming sad product managers. And we don't want any of this. So is there a better way? Of course there's. So I'm going to give you 3 steps to get yourself out of this feature factory, starting with your vision. If you don't have one of these agreed with your team, go back to the drawing board. So this is a format that I like using. You guys might recognize it from Crossing the Chasm by Geoffrey Moore, properly old school book where this was an elevator pitch format. And that book is actually out there. There seems to be like a lending library happening here. So go take a look at this book. Or if you want to grab a copy of these handy guides that Mike mentioned, I've got this and a bunch of other exercises like this in there. But what I like about this is that it asks the right questions, like, how are you going to differentiate? Who are you building for? What problems are you solving? And so use this as a starting point. Don't just put this out there as is. Get your marketing team or your copywriting team to help turn it into something a little bit more compelling than this. And then get it up on the walls around the office. Communicate it. Check that your team understands your vision. Make sure everyone is on board with where it is that you're going as a company. And then map out your objectives. And now these can be basically they're meant to be outcome-based goals that are tied to your company strategy. Now you might know these as KPIs. You heard the term OKRs earlier this morning as well. It doesn't matter what you call them or exactly how you manage them. Just use what works for you and your team. The whole point is that you're creating these guardrails for your team so they understand how you're actually measuring success. It keeps everyone pointing in the same direction and working on the right sorts of things. And then the key thing is to focus on the outcome instead of the output. Traditionally, a lot of product and development teams are measured by output. How many story points did you do? What's your velocity like? What's your burn down chart looking like this week? Whereas measuring outcomes means that you're tying the stuff back to the company level goals. And finally, change your timeline out for these time horizons. So in the first bucket, you've got the current. It's much more granular. It's about your current focus and what's keeping your team busy. What are you testing and checking right now? The future column is less about individual initiatives and much more about problems that you think you need to solve. You heard about this one as well earlier today, called the Now, Next, Later format, and allows you to outline what's important to you right now, but still give that direction, still outline the problems that need to be solved down the line. And really what you're doing with the stuff in the future is you're outlining stuff that just needs to be validated. That's a really key point because the roadmap is about validation. As a matter of fact, your roadmap is a prototype, but for your strategy. So just as you might validate a new feature idea by drawing it out on a piece of paper and taking it to a customer and getting their feedback on it, and then throwing out that paper and starting again based on what the feedback was, your roadmap isn't a perfect plan. It's a starting point for conversations to make sure that your strategy is on point, that makes sense for your company, that includes the right sort of problems to solve. And so if you put those 3 things together, your vision, your objectives, and your time horizons, you get a lean roadmap. And so if you're looking at this roadmap, each of these blocks represents a problem to be solved, an initiative. And each one is linked to a specific objective. So I've shown the objectives in colors there. So this is one popular configuration. Another one that I see that's very similar is grouping cards by objective, creating these streams. But the core thing is, the value of this format is that it takes the focus off building features and hitting delivery dates and turns it into much more around solving problems, right? Gets your team striving towards that problem-solving way of thinking. And speaking of problems, nothing stifles innovation like a to-do list as long as your arm. And yet this is a state that so many teams get stuck in. Who's got a Trello board like this? You've got this all-in-one backlog that has this massive, bloated, vertigo-inducing pile of tickets that are lined up to do next. And it's stressing out your development team who are looking down the barrel of a million tasks, and yet they're completely undefined. And it freaks out the non-tech team who are just wondering where their ideas keep going to die. They just wondering why none of their ideas ever see the light of day. So the solution to this is actually quite simple. Break your backlog up into two parts, your product backlog and your development backlog. See, the thing is backlog is a really broad term that means like all the things you're going to do. But the development backlog should be the stuff that's ready and approved for dev. They are estimated, they're prioritized, they're short. This is your Jira backlog of tickets and bugs and things that you know need to be done. It's just waiting for the team to start their sprint and start picking up and working on that stuff. Whereas the product backlog should live separately. This is where your customer requests, your ideas from within the team, insights that you're getting from experiments that you're running. This is a much fuzzier backlog, but the key is that it should be transparent. It should be something that your whole team can search and add to. It's where you will prototype and spec out ideas and connect them to the objectives that they're meant to hit. So this side of your backlog is key to your strategy, whereas your development backlog is key to your execution side of things. So split your backlog into these two parts to avoid having a beast of a backlog. And so as your product matures, experimentation starts to get scarier as well. So we've seen this today and probably many other times before, the build, measure, learn diagram. And it seems simple. It is simple, really. That is, until you've got competition nipping at your heels and a growing base of customers asking for more and more and tech debt creeping in at the edges. Your company enters panic mode and they start shoveling fixes and features out the door and they neglect to focus on anything but the build part. And it usually happens at other crucial pieces of this, like the building, like the actual measuring and learning. And you actually find yourself in what we call the build trap. You're actually going to hear a lot about the build trap tomorrow because Melissa Perry wrote a book on this and she's speaking about it. So I'm not going to go into detail of all the ways to escape the build trap, but one really quick way to get yourself out, or to sum that up, is to create the time and space to validate the work that's being done. It's not that people don't understand that it's important to move the right metrics. It's often that they don't have the permission and time to stop building and actually do the measurements. So one way you can avoid the build trap is by implementing some form of dual track agile. Now there's as many ways to do dual track agile as there are ways of doing agile itself, so I'm not going to get dogmatic on this. But the essence is that you give as much time and as much importance to figuring out what's right to build as you do actually building stuff. So start off with a discovery track to find out if a product idea is any good. Anything that's successful from that track goes into your delivery track. Anything that comes out of the delivery track goes back into the discovery track to find out if it actually solved the problem or not. And so having a dual track approach allows you to build in that safe space for validation. Now I see a bad habit all the time, and that's that a team finishes off a project. So you release something, you close all the tickets in Jira, you wipe down the whiteboard, crumple up all those post-it notes, and you start moving on to the next thing, which looks really great for cadence, but isn't very good for making sure that you're actually solving problems. After all, just because something was launched doesn't mean it solves the problem you set it out to do. So your lean roadmap can actually help you here. So each card, as we said, was a problem to be solved and is tied to an objective. And what you can actually do is track the experiments connected to those initiatives that can be run. So if you're going to be trying to solve that problem at the top there, here's a few experiments that are running, and you can actually track that through and see the progress of these things. So you can actually use your roadmap to give you this ongoing progress report of how your experimentation is going. And once a project is done in development, don't just throw it out of the roadmap. Whether it passes or fails, or more often than not lands somewhere in the middle, keep the results. Don't throw them out. Move them into some sort of list of completed cards. Some sort of validation roadmap. Oh, almost. Okay. So the purpose here is to give you space to track what was released and when, and to outline the results itself. So did it actually solve the problem you were setting out to do? Did it move the metric? Did it move the needle? So by building this validation space into your roadmap, you actually create a space to show the value of the work done. And it helps to remember that it's not your job to have all the answers. As a matter of fact, you are supposed to know less than your colleagues. Instead, you should be focusing on asking the best questions, like what problem are you trying to solve? But also creating a safe space for everyone so that they feel like they can contribute. To really excel with experimentation, you need to build psychological safety within your team. And that's about making people feel comfortable speaking up, reporting errors, pitching in to help out with the product. Now, how do you build this psychological safety within your own team? Well, there's actually a few language tweaks that you can do that help subtly set the stage for psychological safety. One of my favorite ways is to phrase questions so they begin with, "How might we?" It turns the issue into a collective problem. It supposes instead of asserts. And it works really well in conjunction with, "I bet." Because as a product manager, you're going to be wrong a lot. And I bet gives you permission to try and to fail and, try again. After all, it wasn't you who was wrong, it was your hypothesis. And now that you know it doesn't work, you can feel free to move on to the next thing. So shifts in your language like this can just help set the stage for psychological safety and help get your team on board with more experimentation. And as any product matures, it starts to create a market that starts looking really tasty to other startups. If you've got any measure of success, whether that's revenue or PR or market share or whatever else, you can guarantee someone is coming in trying to disrupt you and trying to take over parts of your market. So I like to think about companies on this risk appetite scale. Companies start off at the very, very far end. They're nimble and lean. They've got a copy of the Lean Startup under their arm. They've read it. They're ready to use it in anger. Whereas on the opposite end, you've got the slow and risk-averse companies, right? You're slow moving. I've met people here who are in insurance and banking and airlines and all sorts of stuff like that. Now, slow moving companies have a benefit in that it often results in piles of massive cash, right? Because they're winning, they're doing something right here. But as soon as you have any of that, smaller, nimble and lean companies are going to be coming after those piles of cash. The best companies are the ones who realize that they are going to be disrupted and start figuring out ways to diversify their portfolio, the way that they're working, to use some of that cash so that they can disrupt themselves before someone else does. So I've actually seen 4 different approaches for this, and I'm going to share them with you. The first one is the Google. Google is pretty famous for their 20% time, and that's basically the equivalent of 1 day a week to go work on stuff that isn't your day job. And it might seem like a colossal waste of resources, and not all of us have 20% to give, but some of their core products like Gmail and Maps and even failed products like Wave came out of this. Now, these are products that turned into much more successful pieces for them. 20% might be too much for some of us, but can we carve off maybe just 2% of our resources towards some sort of R&D, or 0.2%? Companies who carve off this time do tend to find new product areas that excel for them down the line. The hackathon is just as good for building disruptive products as it is for team building. So it's one of my favorites. So give your team a time box week of freedom to hack away, to create something, and you might just be onto the start of some new product line that's useful for you later on. The lab is an approach used by a lot of larger organizations, like large corporates. Usually those going through their digital transformation. And so what it basically is a small division of a large company that looks and acts like a startup, except has the corporate backing of their parent company to help fund anything that comes out of it that's successful. And finally, the Facebook. Facebook has one of the largest user bases in the world, but never do they ever launch something to everyone all at once. They've mastered the art of hyper-segmentation. They could release a feature just to us here today or just to a small city in Kansas if they so wished, because what they're able to do then is test out riskier products and try new things, find ways to disrupt themselves rather than trying to disrupt their entire client base, even though they are a huge organization. And so all of these are tactics that can help your company disrupt your own maturing product before it enters the decline stage. Your goal is to breathe new life into your maturing product by adding value or expanding your market. And if done right, you can extend your product's life and expand revenues even further. So, beat the feature factory by ditching your timeline and focusing on solving real problems. Conquer that beast of a backlog by separating the strategic parts from the execution. Learn to love experimenting again by building in a safe place for validation. And figure out how to disrupt yourself before someone else does. And that is how you can grow up lean. Thank you very much.